Hello, ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the Normal and Heroic Raid Guide for Korog. And this is the second to last boss in Highmaul. Very kind of chaotic and quite difficult encounter overall. There are a lot of various abilities going on, and things happen quite quickly, transitioning from one ability to the next. There are some random elements as well, so you have to kind of get used to the frequency that things can happen. But the basic idea is to deal with the Nullification Barrier on the boss, soak up your own Nullification Barrier on one of your raid members, use that Nullification Barrier to soak up the bombs that drop throughout the fight, and then in addition to that, handle the various adds and the 4 basic Expel magic casts that the boss will use. So a lot of stuff happening. Let's get started with the basics. So as mentioned, Nullification Barrier is a big part of this fight, so we'll talk about that first. When the boss initially engages you, he will have Nullification Barrier active, and this will absorb all magical damage dealt to him until you deal enough damage to break through the shield. Once you break through the barrier, he will move to the center of the room and spend 20 seconds recharging the shield, and then he will re-engage you with a fresh shield active, and this process repeats over and over. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to balance your raid around how much magical damage you have present or not, because all the damage is useful in various ways, but just be aware that the shield exists. Depending on your UI, you will have an extra action bar of some kind that should indicate how much damage is left on the shield. So for my UI, for example, you can see in the center at the bottom is my target frame with the boss's health, and just below that there's a gray bar that indicates how much of his shield is remaining. And when this runs to 0 and the shield is dissipated, he'll go to the center and start recharging it. Now once the boss goes into the middle of the room and starts to recharge his barrier, he will surround himself with sort of a protective aura. You can see a very obvious golden rain that's coming down. And while this is occurring, the first raid member to step inside this golden circle will receive a stack of the Nullification Barrier. And in addition, they'll start taking damage from caustic energy, which is just an aura or dot that will do damage to that first player as they're inside the circle. Now, this is critical for use dealing with one of the main abilities in this fight. So, because the Nullification Barrier and caustic energy only applies to the very first player that steps into the circle for any particular recharge phase, you want to make sure that you designate which player should go in at any given time. Because as soon as one player steps in, they'll be marked or designated by the game as the only player that can gain that for that phase. So you don't want to accidentally give it to someone else by having everyone in the middle. For this reason, it's important to watch the shield level of the boss as his barrier gets reduced, and when it's about to drop off completely, clear out the center of the room. Then when he goes in the middle and starts to recharge himself, you can then have the one designated player that's going to soak that particular shield step into the middle first, and once they've stepped in at least once, they can stay there, and everyone else can freely go into the circle as well. It won't impact anyone else once the first person has been afflicted. While the person is inside the circle for the 20 seconds and they're taking caustic energy, they need to be healed quite significantly. However, all healing will be converted into absorption applied to their own Nullification Barrier shield. And the ratio is massive. I think it's 10 or 20 to 1, depending on your difficulty. But suffice to say, if you can heal the player through the entire 20 seconds and get basically their maximum shield, they'll have a shield of upwards of 10 million damage. This will allow you to soak a lot of the falling orbs that we'll talk about in a moment. So that's the basic goal. You need to repeat this process over and over, throwing in a new specific player into the center every time the boss charges up as well. So the way to think about it is he's charging his shield once, you're charging one of your player's shields once as well. Second time he charges, you also charge a second player, and so on. And if you do this properly, you'll have enough players that are able to absorb other mechanics and save your raid from a lot of potential damage. Now, the order of players that you want to send into the center to get their own barrier is really up to your raid, but generally it's going to be ranged DPS and possibly healers. So we opted for ranged DPS with high movement abilities or teleports. So hunters were our first priority, our warlocks were second, and then the rest of our ranged DPS from then on. And again, the reason for this is to help soak up orbs which spawn in random locations, and therefore you need a significant amount of movement, but more importantly, just so that the player can keep attacking while they're standing there waiting for an orb to fall down. It has to be a ranged, or a healer can obviously stand there and heal while they're doing it too. But not melee, that's the main thing. So, why do you want to get nullification barriers on players? It's to soak up overflowing energy, which are indicated on the ground by little tiny green circles. You can see one by the red marker there in the background, two actually by the red marker. And if you look above where the green circle is, you'll see a giant energy orb that's floating in the sky and it's falling down. When that orb hits the ground, if there are no players underneath it to soak it, it will do massive damage to the entire raid. And if there is one player underneath it, it will just do even more massive damage to the single player. It's over 1 million damage to that individual, and it cannot be mitigated by damage reduction cooldowns. So this is why you need players with the nullification barrier, the personal nullification barrier, with the 10 million plus absorption available to soak up those orbs. If you do the rotations in the nullification barrier properly and get enough people with them, you can soak up the majority of those orbs as they come down. Now, as the fight progresses, you'll start to get more and more of the overflowing energy orbs falling at the same time. So you'll start off with one at a time, then two at a time, three at a time, so on. Generally speaking, if you do the rotation properly to add an additional person with the barrier each time, you'll probably have about one orb that goes unmitigated in each set. And that is significantly manageable damage. It's not a problem. But if you fail to do the nullification barrier soaking properly, and you don't have people that can get the orbs, later in the fight you're going to have 2, 3, 4 of them going off simultaneously, and you will just wipe to that damage. So that's the whole purpose of getting that shield going on players when the boss is recharging himself. The next point is suppression fields, and you'll see these moderately sized circles on the ground to the right. There's a bunch of them. These are cast on random ranged raid members very frequently, and the boss will leap to that player, kind of do an animation, and he'll slam the ground with his weapon and create a suppression field. So you can dodge these, but you have to be very quick to react. But generally speaking, you should just plan to have the one player that's being targeted hit by it without hitting other players. So to do this, you can just spread the ranged raid members and the healers around the outside of the inner circle there. You don't want to have ranged in the middle because you don't want to drop fields underneath the melee, of course. The suppression field itself does significant damage while you're standing inside it, and it also silences both you and enemies that are inside the field. So again, if you just spread the raid properly, only one or maybe even two people will get hit each time he uses it. They can just step out of the field after a tick or two and continue on with the fight. Now you may notice during the barrier phase that a lot of little adds called Volatile Anomalies are spawning. During the 20-second phase, they will spawn in pairs right next to the boss, and they're just normal adds. They should be picked up by one of your tanks. The difficulty with these adds is when they die, they will explode for significant damage to the entire raid. However, just like players that step into suppression fields, if an add is inside a suppression field, when it dies, it will be silenced and therefore unable to cast that spell when it dies. So the basic idea is during the barrier phase, when the adds are spawning, have one tank pick up all the adds without killing any of them. Once the phase is over and all the adds have spawned, the tank then moves into a suppression field, has all the raid DPS switch and kill them off, and then once they're dying inside the field, they will not cast that AE nuke, and everyone will be safe. The key thing to remember is that obviously the tank will be silenced while he or she is inside the field, So you'll need to use outside cooldowns, a lot of spam healing, all that good stuff, so the tank can, remain alive from that damage. But that's the basic idea. Another possible strategy, which you don't really see footage of here, but we tried in later kills on this fight, is to purposely stack ranged raid members, particularly healers, behind an existing field during the phase. So what that means is like the boss is in the center doing his recharge. The healers keep a particular field between themselves and the boss so that when the adds aggro them invariably due to heal threat, they will be forced to go through the existing field. The tank can then just stand with the healers at the time, letting the adds come to them, and once they're all gathered again, just step forward into the suppression field and kill them off. So again, we didn't use that. We didn't necessarily need it, but it's a pretty solid tactic. You just have to position the fields properly beforehand so that there's a good one to stand behind. And also keep in mind that the fields do have a duration, so you have to make sure you're using a pretty new one so that it doesn't disappear halfway through. So finally, we'll cover all of the Expel magic abilities. These are 4 basic Expel magic casts that the boss will use throughout the fight. And he uses them at varying frequencies, so we'll go over them in order of most to least common. So by far the most common is Arcane, which is cast on the current main tank of the boss. It's just a debuff that forces a tank swap. Once it's on the tank for 10 seconds, that tank will drop little tiny arcane bombs at their current location that will explode after 1.5 seconds, dealing pretty heavy damage in a small radius. So the idea here, as soon as Arcane debuffs the current tank, the off tank at the time quickly taunts the boss so that the tank with Arcane can run away. And they just run away for 10 seconds, kiting in a path that doesn't pass through anybody else, so that neither the tank that's targeted nor anyone else in the raid gets actually hit by the arcane bombs that go off. And then after it's gone, you just go back and resume the fight. So that's really the tank swap mechanic, so to speak. The second most common Expel is Frost. And this will create a very large frost orb at the location of a random raid member, preferably ranged, it seems. And once this is out, it deals heavy frost damage as well as slowing players that are within it. It's a huge radius. So the best thing you can do is use movement boost abilities if you're in the affliction range to get out quickly, and that's that. It does more damage and snares you to a greater degree based on how close you are to the center of the orb. So the faster you can get out, the better. But otherwise, this kind of ties into spreading the ranged raid members around for suppression field jumps. The same rules apply for the orb. You don't want as many people afflicted by it when it hits, so spreading out will help mitigate that somewhat. The next most common is Fire. This will debuff the entire raid with a 10-second dot, and it does pretty low damage over time itself. But the key component to this ability is when it is removed, either from Dispel or Expiration, it will cause the player to explode in a small radius around them for extra fire damage. So, because it's on everybody, the key here is to decide whether you want to manually dispel some of them or allow them all to expire naturally. What's interesting about this mechanic is if you manually dispel, the damage that it does in a small radius around that player is about 20 or 25% of the damage it does if you let it expire naturally. And I believe, my theory anyway, is that this is because the designers didn't want to totally hinder melee DPS, essentially. So when melee, you have a big clump of melee DPS, and they have this debuff, and rather than forcing them all to run away so that they can let the debuff expire, you can simply dispel the melee. Manually dispelling them will cause a 25% area of effect damage to hit rather than the full 100%. And so, you know, 4 melee getting manually dispelled is equivalent to 1 melee not getting dispelled, is the idea. So what we did, and it worked pretty well, is assuming everyone's topped off, you can just mass dispel from a priest on top of the melee clump, and they'll take moderate damage since there's so many of them, they're stacked up, but it will get rid of it for the reduced damage value. And then the rest of the raid, the ranged and the healers, just spread out and let the debuff expire naturally. Since if you're spread out, it doesn't do any extra damage to anyone else, so that works pretty well. But if you're having trouble with it, absolutely just have your melee spread out as well when it's about to expire. And shouldn't have too much trouble with it either way. The last Expel magic, and certainly the least in this case, is Shadow. This is the most infrequently cast, and it's also the weakest. It will debuff everyone in the raid again. This time it's just a heal absorption. That's all it does. So it just absorbs a flat amount of healing to all the players in the raid. So you just have to heal them up enough to get rid of the absorption part, and then you can actually do effective healing to their health pool after that. So we just found using one raid cooldown each time it was cast was plenty, and you don't even arguably need to use a raid cooldown for them, but obviously it will help if there's other damage going on at the time. So Shadow's pretty basic, not much to think about. And with that, I think that covers everything for Korog. Like I said, it's a very chaotic fight, especially early on, when you're kind of learning all the things that can happen. There's a lot of stuff going on, and the best thing you can do, in my opinion, is to just practice one aspect of the fight, one or two maybe, each attempt, and eventually it'll all come together. So obviously practice the Nullification Barrier stuff first. Make sure you have someone assigned to call out when the shield is about to fall off the boss so that everyone can clear out of the center. And then you just have the assigned player that's next in the rotation step in first. Once they've stepped in, you can have melee attack at that point. Meanwhile, your tank should be gathering the adds and preparing to go into a suppression field. So you can kind of practice that part first, get that down, and then you can move on to mastering the Expel magic parts, and then tank positioning, and so on and so forth. Just build on it slowly, and it'll quickly come together. So that is the normal and heroic raid guide for Korog. As always, good luck, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.